Cause of AIDS, of course. At that time, we didn't have the full proof what's the cause of AIDS.
That initial work was rapidly reinforced by additional virology and serology studies in Bob Gallo's lab in Washington.
Gallo got pushed by the Reagan administration that wanted to do something on AIDS finally. They literally told us to just close CDC's lab down. We don't care about it. There's a bunch of gays, who gives a shit? I mean, that was really their whole story. So the whole thing that they rested their political response was, well, we discovered the virus.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The probable cause of AIDS has been found.
Credit must go to our eminent Dr. Robert Gallo, who directed the research that produced this discovery.
What was new that day is for the first time we were saying, that's the cause, I'm sure.
It was a civic press conference. There was not evidence then that HIV was the cause of AIDS. It wasn't called HIV. There was certainly evidence that he didn't discover it. It was discovered in France.
The conference was held before any of Robert Gallo's papers were published, therefore before any other scientist had a chance to review them and look at the evidence and see if he got it right or wrong.
Gallo's philosophy was to have people to whom he would give the virus be in his own control, so that any information that came out of that would come through him, so that he got all the information, indeed often put his name on publications and would, quote, collaborate with them. But should you have any broader view other than his personal glory and your personal glory, this was not a scientific pursuit in any way.
The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services decided from now on we are only going to fund AIDS research that assumes that Robert Gallo's virus is the cause.
I didn't think that HIV in 1984 was the cause of AIDS. That's why I did the study comparing gay men with Kaposi's and gay men with pneumocystis. I assumed there must be something else. If you go read my paper from 1985 that Kern and Jaffe would not sign on to, I actually lay out the cofactor hypothesis in that paper.
I'm a promoter of the role of cofactors in AIDS.
Well, cofactors just says that the cause of a disease is by more than one factor.
Just simply being infected with HIV is not going to do it. You need certain cofactors.
Cofactors are not necessary.
Dr. Fauci would say HIV causes AIDS without the need for anything else. That's kind of ridiculous.
The data that indicate that any different type of infection like mycoplasma or something like that is a necessary cofactor, I believe those theories have been debunked.
What the fuck does he mean? Sorry. What's it? What does he mean that there are no cofactors? Where's he coming from? There's cofactors for everything.
Cofactor implies something specific. And it really gets us off into tracks that are wandering.
Gallo isn't gonna change his mind. But he's probably 70 years plus now. He's gonna remember things. You know, we all remember things that are good for us. And we forget the bad things. The cofactors are important to really understand how people get ill, why they get ill.
What is asked of an AIDS journalist is to deny an existing reality, which is a strong, growing body of dissent on a scientific question.
In August of '92, my dad had just read his latest National Review, and there was an article in there about Peter Duesberg, a maverick cell biologist. He said he didn't think HIV caused AIDS.
To deny that this well-identified, well-characterized virus is linked with AIDS is, to my mind, just potty.
He said, I can't replicate this in my office. I can't get this virus to do anything. We thought, oh my gosh, my dad is really daydreaming. He's trying to wish this all away because he knows how upset we are. Just wish it all away, and everybody will be gone happy.
If Fauci would say, here's $1 billion for alternative theories of AIDS, you wouldn't believe what's going to happen. A lot of HIV researchers overnight would start cofactors. The first year they would call them cofactors of HIV. And the next year, the co would be topped and HIV would be topped a year later.
Peter is highly intelligent. He did excellent work. I mean, no wonder he got a full professorship in Berkeley and was nominated to the American Academy of Sciences. But I told you very frankly that he's killing people with his theories, and I still stick to that.
They attack him, they attack his ideas, and they present some bogus way of refuting what his science has said that doesn't really refute it.
Peter Duisberg?
Yes.
Oh.
They're all prostitutes, most of them, my colleagues, to some degree, myself. You have to be a prostitute to get money for your research. You're trained a little bit to be a prostitute. But some go all the way.
In light of all this scientific uncertainty, I asked Dr. Fauci for evidence linking HIV to immune deficiency disease.
When you put the combined findings of the initial characterization as a distinct retrovirus isolated by Montagnier and his group, together with Gallo linking the virus to being the cause of AIDS, and they put those things together, and that's how we have a confirmation of the causative agent of AIDS, namely HIV.
Still unclear about the evidence for HIV's existence, I decided the best way to verify it would be to actually see it. I asked Dr. Hans Gelderblum, a world-renowned electron microscopist, if he thought there was any reason to question Dr. Montagnier's published images.
I've seen these publications, stamp-sized images. It's a nuisance. It's a nuisance. You do not really see much.
When we saw that photo, we said, suggestive, but not convincing.
Dr. Gallo, 1 year later, published photographs he claimed to be of HIV. Were his any better?
These pictures were not so impressive. They were not much better than Montagnier's images.
It's one thing to look like, and another thing is to be a virus.
In 2002, I stumbled across an article by Valander Turner and Andrew McIntyre of the Perth Group in Australia, and it questions whether there's ever even been found a virus. I became consumed with researching this. I could read from morning till night every day, and every link to another link, and I would email to these people and say, where's the test? I want to know. Am I dying? Am I contagious? And they weren't even very kind. They were just like, read our articles again. How many times do we have to tell you there's no test?
It is crucial to understand that an AIDS diagnosis is forever. It cannot be reversed or alleviated.
The stigma attached to people knowing that you have it and are living with it is worse than actually living with it.
I can't think of anybody who's ever been evicted from their apartment because they had breast cancer or because they had cerebral palsy.
I did a campaign to address stigma. The message is that if anyone is infected, we are all affected. Some have it medically, some have it socially, some have it culturally. And at the end of the day, if it exists anywhere, it exists everywhere.
We don't all have AIDS. And once you start bullshitting, it gets a problem. You know, we don't all have AIDS. We all have to be sympathetic to AIDS. And yes, there's all kinds of people who get HIV infection. But we don't need to make, in my view, non-truths, or just to have a slogan or a symbol. We all have AIDS. No, we don't all have AIDS.
But my message is you do have it, whether you want to accept it or not. Are you medically susceptible? Maybe not. But are you socially vulnerable? Yes.
In June of 2007, the BBC featured a news story which began, HIV infection theory challenged.
Living cells are complicated, and how they work inside the body is even more complicated. So there's still a lot of debate as to how exactly HIV causes AIDS.
In March of 2008, the Washington Post went on to state that multiple surprises have reminded researchers how much they still don't know about HIV's biology.
HIV has got to get inside
the circulation of the body. And it does that in ways that are not completely understood.
The prime target for HIV is a T cell population called CD4 helper T cells.
The way that the virus gets into the target cell, it fuses its membrane to the membrane of the cell.
I don't understand the fusion process. I don't think anybody completely understands it.
We have a relatively poor understanding of how viral proteins interact with proteins in the cell.
How come our antibodies aren't able to keep HIV in check?
It's an excellent question. That's one of the great stumbling blocks.
They can't prove that HIV is the cause of AIDS, okay? They cannot prove that HIV is the cause of the collapse of the immune system, no matter how many scientific journals says it is. When you go to the basic research, it doesn't prove it.
We are almost convinced that there is other factors that are involved in the loss of CD4 cells, and we don't know yet all the mechanism.
How HIV depletes the T cells so an individual advances to AIDS is probably due to multifactorial elements. One is it will kill the cell eventually that it infects. HIV does not necessarily kill the cells that it infects. Some T cells are directly killed by HIV, and other T cells keep the virus in check. It's a silent state within the cell, and I think in many cases these cells can return to a normal function.
Can that cell return to a normal state? I don't think so.
When I was told I was HIV positive, I accepted that on a very deep level. But only by having the courage, the open minds, and the open hearts to answer these questions are we ever going to know how to help people, how to do what we need to do to help people.
In late 2007, Science Daily reported that 3 prominent research teams had published papers in the Journal of Immunology challenging the theory that the sudden loss of T cells triggers disease and AIDS.
The details of HIV pathogenesis, how HIV kills people, are still being worked out.
If the sudden loss of T cells in HIV-positive individuals can't explain why people get disease, then there must be cofactors that cause people to get sick and die, or factors that have absolutely nothing to do with HIV. While researching HIV hotspots, I began to realize there is a direct correlation in these places with another condition that leads to immune deficiency and death.
I think it is important to keep in mind, especially for us in the West, that poverty is not a romantic issue. It is a deadly issue. Poverty leads to diseases and premature death, period.
When you look at the symptoms that they talk about, for people that are HIV positive, you find that some of them, they are more related to malnutrition.
Their nutrition is not very equilibrated. They are in oxidative stress, even they are not infected with HIV. So their immune system doesn't work well already.
People are hungry, they're underdeveloped, there are no hospitals, there's no proper medical care. You take away poverty, you're giving people an ability to fight infections.
These are toilets.
Yeah. We don't have flushing toilets. When flies get into the toilets, they actually can come back to touch our food, you see. And look, we need to take that food. And we don't know which infections are there.
So how do you expect people must survive in these places? Look there. How many white people they are staying in this house like this one? In Cape Town is different. You go to suburbs, you see the suburbs is different from our places.
Why have we done nothing for African people, just like give them clean water so they don't die in infancy of diarrheal disease and stuff like this? All we care about is HIV, AIDS. Well, question, well, there's money in it. There has to be, other dynamic working to lead public interest to the African situation and ignore clean water, sanitation, malaria. I mean, things that kill people.
This is the beginning of a war. It is a war to reclaim our health.
In 2008, USA Today published a news story that stated, "If we look at the data objectively, we are spending too much on AIDS. About $10 billion a year is spent on AIDS, while 2 billion people live with no sanitation. 1 billion lack access to clean water. And malnutrition kills someone every 10 seconds. These factors enable diseases to thrive and severely weaken the immune system of those living in such squalor."
If we were to take all that money and put it towards developing poor countries, God would be so proud of us, indeed, because we would have taken away the major challenge that's facing humankind, and that is people dying in silence. It's slow, painful deaths from being scared of something that was just packaged as AIDS.
Could it be that the real epidemic is extreme poverty, not HIV? On the other hand, HIV allegedly occurs in the United States as well. So I looked for alternative causes of immunodeficiency in this wealthiest of nations.
There are other ways you could produce a condition that looks like AIDS, but they too will be some source that causes a severe defect in the immune response.
19 million Americans now, 19 million are taking illicit drugs every day. But we don't talk about this. This is politically incorrect.
There have been a number of theories as to what the origin of HIV/AIDS is. One of them was a theory that certainly turned out to be completely incorrect, that it's a lifestyle phenomenon.
There's a large epidemic of STDs in general in the late 70s, and particularly in gay men. In San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles were meccas of the new lifestyle, which came from the liberation in the post-Stonewall era.
The more partners you could have, the more you were striking a blow for gay lib. I remember talking to one of the people who was at the forefront of that lifestyle. It very much felt like if he did have another bout of syphilis or gonorrhea, whatever it might be, that it was like a notch, a victory notched up for his right to exist as a gay man.
I went on a vacation to Los Angeles, and it wasn't that wild, but one night I went to a bathhouse. I came home with, get this, at the same time, syphilis, gonorrhea, and 2 forms of parasites.
I have no views about that, you know, in a judgmental kind of sense, but certainly from a public health point of view, that's kind of a prescription for disaster, because AIDS first occurred in these men who were not healthy for reasons that were obvious to everyone.
You're talking thousands of partners, sometimes hundreds, per month, lots of antibiotic use, lots of drug use, and the result were people were getting pretty sick.
There's a drug called amyl nitrate. It was developed in the 1850s and 60s. Came in ampules, and they became known as poppers because you'd pop them when you open these ampules up to sniff them when you had coronary artery disease. The first AIDS cases, for example, that Mike Gottlieb reported were all 5 gay men. They were young. They all used poppers.
Poppers, something you walk around huffing all night. I mean, it says flammable, fatal if swallowed on the side of the bottle. They're walking around huffing it all night long. Why? Gives you a great rush.
Poppers was a sex drug. They were in every gay bathhouse, every bar, every porno bookstore across the nation. Poppers were visible on the dance floor in the discos. At the end of an evening, the bartender would announce last call for alcohol, last call for poppers.
It was like a mad, wonderful kind of a dance that was being done. But if you think that can happen forever, you're wrong.
Whether or not HIV exists, whether its role in a weakened immune system is almost irrelevant when you compare it to what was going on at that time.
The lifestyle explanation proved politically unacceptable, but the virus explanation proved very, very acceptable to many different parties.
Pneumocystis pneumonia and Kaposi sarcoma were the hallmark diseases for AIDS in the early years.
To go back and deconstruct it and say, what exactly did cause pneumocystis carinea?
I remember the first patient that I ever saw, my resident brought me to see a young gay man with pneumocystis pneumonia. I knew a little bit about the use of poppers or amyl nitrite inhalants, and I started asking the patient if he used them, and it turned out that he was a very heavy user of amyl nitrites, and much to the surprise of my students, I said, I think the man probably has destroyed his pulmonary immune system by inhaling this toxin.
What exactly caused Kaposi sarcoma? We know that now. It was amyl nitrite.
We saw KS decline, interestingly parallel to the decline in popper use.
We now know that Kaposi sarcoma is caused by a second virus, the human herpes virus strain 8.
To rescue comes another virus. As always, when you're in trouble, you find another virus.
If one wants to look at really what causes this, we've got to look beyond just HIV and just beyond HHV8.
Calling it a disease, see? And to give it that name, AIDS. So everything's included under that, and you don't have to just say, I mean, if you just said, you know, these people are getting a lot of weird diseases, all kinds of diseases, it wouldn't have had the same impact. It was much better to say, there is an infectious organism on the loose in America, and it could get you.
I had interviewed the world's leading HIV experts and discovered that the two benchmark diseases of AIDS have alternate explanations. Once again, I turned to Dr. Gelderblum, seeking proof of HIV's existence in the most recent images available.
Here, you do not see anything about the details, but I would say it's probably a virus.
These are HIV here?
Yeah.
Oh, so are these HIV too?
Yeah, yeah.
Everything's
Probably.
Probably.
Yeah.
What can I tell you? You know, I mean, it exists. Gallo said he had all these viruses, and it was a lie.
I think HIV totally has turned out not to be the cause of AIDS. HIV has turned out not to be.
Gelderblum's images, said to come from isolated HIV cultures, provided no proof for HIV's existence. So I asked Nobel laureate Dr. David Baltimore and Dr. Robin Weiss how they would isolate and photograph this elusive virus.
Well, didn't Dr. Gallo do that? I mean, he actually isolated it, so... Yeah. I mean, why should I do all of this? This is all textbook stuff you're asking me.
I'm not quite sure what's behind your question about isolation.
I don't want to be your textbook, you know? Okay. I got other things to do.
They're embarrassed. The scientists have been embarrassed about this. They know that it's flawed.
In 1987, the CDC made two mind-boggling changes in the definition of AIDS, which are in effect today. You can be diagnosed with AIDS without ever having an HIV test.
In 1987, I had a lesion on my arm, and it was KS, Kaposi sarcoma.
The doctor diagnosed you with AIDS without an HIV test?
Yeah.
You can be diagnosed with AIDS if you've tested negative for HIV.
Alvin Friedman Keene found 16 patients with Kaposi sarcoma among gay men in New York City in the 80s. They did not have HIV infection. Yet they had AIDS by our definition, right?
In a World Health Organization publication, Dr. Chin writes, "It should be emphasized that the surveillance definitions for AIDS were not intended to be reliable indicators of HIV infection."
If you have thousands of documented cases of AIDS without HIV, how can HIV cause AIDS?
Why do you believe that HIV does cause AIDS?
Because that's all the information that I've been given.
Because we've never been taught anything different.
We have read it, heard it.
Because that's what the scientific community has told us.
Scientists are supposed to observe, experiment, and reason from what they observe. They're not supposed to grab hold of an idea and cling to it and adjust everything else in their perceptions to fit that idea.
I think an HIV positive test means that your life is forever changed. You have a whole new battery of things to consider for yourself. What does it mean to me?
It's very hard to find anyone who supports you when you say, I don't think I'm going to die of HIV or AIDS.
The typical model of HIV equals AIDS equals death. How invested am I going to be in that model?
Everyone who's infected with HIV would like to deny it. I mean, it's a bad prognosis. It means you're going to take drugs for the rest of your life, et cetera, et cetera. So there's people who want to say, I'm one of the people who tested positive, but I'm not going to get the disease.
Do I start treatment? Treatment meaning the antiviral drugs, if ever?
We started taking Lindsay to a doctor at the Children's Medical Clinic. She gave us a prescription for retrovir syrup, which is AZT. It was so important for us to get something to help our baby that we sat on the floor in the pharmacy and gave her first dose.
Shortly after Lindsay began AZT treatment, side effects began to emerge.
Her eating habits changed quite a bit. She didn't eat well. She was hard to handle at the table. And then the leg cramps started. Once that started, it got progressively worse.
She would just grab him and go, ow, you know, screaming in the middle of the night. Just like it was it wasn't an ache, it was like, must have been sharp pains. It just made you feel sick to your stomach.
Any drug active on HIV will be toxic because it's not 100% specific on the HIV enzymes.
When we switched over to the university, then the dosage of AZT went up, and that's where she started flattening out on her growth chart. The doctors would try to put a positive spin on how well she was progressing. It was mainly in the T cells that weren't always a positive situation.
Yeah, the T cell count would go down, and then the doctors would say, well, maybe we better raise that AZT dosage, get that T cell count back up. We were going, I think it's kind of making her sick because she doesn't want to eat. She's having leg cramps. And they'd say, well, it's the HIV, and that's what it does. It's all part of the package.
The treatment causes a very similar condition we would expect from an AIDS patient. That's why nobody noticed that there was something wrong with the treatment.
I remember in 1992, after I first tested positive, I became involved in an organization called Women at Risk. There were 11 of us at the time on the board and involved in the group. All of us except 3 were on the medications. In the year and a half that I was involved with Women at Risk, every single woman in that organization on the drugs died. Every single one, except the 3 of us who weren't taking them.
We weren't just given handfuls of AZT, we demanded it.
AZT should be praised. Where is your humanity?
We considered the FDA not giving us these things as being anti-gay instead of being responsible. And so we went and we lobbied and we pushed for all these things, and we didn't think clearly about what it was we were asking for. It's like that saying, be careful what you ask for, it may come to pass.
That's the very reason why everybody believed HIV is a deadly virus, because the HIV positive patient at that time got a deadly treatment.
Despite the billions spent on the drug, tens of thousands of people with AIDS have died. And now a growing number of studies are questioning the drug's usefulness.
We just decided between ourselves in November to write to Peter Duisberg and say, sorry to bother you. Are you for real? And if Lindsay were your daughter, what would you do? On November 11th, we got a big package, and he said, you must take your daughter off AZT immediately or she will die from it like Kimberly Begalis.
That is AIDS by prescription. You get immunodeficiency and you die from the tox. That is AIDS by prescription.
When AZT became widely available in 1985 and 1986, I cautioned my patients not to jump on the bandwagon and start being treated. I didn't want to see my community poisoned by an ineffective therapy.
I think in retrospect, the dose that we started with AZT was a dangerous and poorly tolerated dose.
Nobody wants to realize what was the real effect of this overtreatment. That means that we killed a whole generation of AIDS patients.
In '96, David Ho announced highly active antiretroviral therapy.
Also known as the cocktail, because the treatment combined the newly developed protease inhibitors with older HIV drugs, such as the chemotherapy drug AZT.
That was a revolution. What was an 100% fatal illness now could be treated.
The AIDS medication today is not that toxic than it was in the early days. And it's a potent drug regime. That means it kills almost everything.
I play around with treatment interruption because I think the drugs are toxic. And if I do the drugs continuously without interruption, I think that they'll have a cumulative damage.
In the years that we've been using the cocktail, we've found that there are lots of side effects.
In South Africa, I spoke to a couple of pharmacists specializing in HIV treatment.
How often do you see side effects in patients? Yeah, all the time. All the time.
Almost all the time.
We saw the lipodystrophy, the buffalo humps at the back of the neck, then the lipoatrophy, which is the loss of fat in the face and the arms, giving people a very gaunt look.
The risk of heart attack seems to be increased in people on these drugs.
With what we have now, the side effects eventually are going to outweigh the benefits.
So patients really do better for the short term, but in the long term, they die also.
In 1994, Audrey Serrano tested HIV positive. While initially healthy, she was prescribed AIDS drugs which nearly killed her and left her scarred for life. In December 2007, after multiple negative tests, she was awarded $2.5 million in damages.
Some people are very fortunate. They don't have these side effects, but many people do. So prolonged treatment is impossible.
I know people that are like horses, have no impact with some drugs, no side effects, and somebody else falls apart.
The new generation of antiretroviral drugs are less toxic. They can be more tolerated. But for how long? I agree. We cannot give a treatment for life. It's not like insulin, you know, it's something which is toxic.
Has a patient ever died from the side effects?
Yeah, sometimes it happens.
AIDS drugs are all classified as black box drugs. A black box drug is the most severe warning that our FDA will put on a product. It means you could die taking this because other people have died taking this.
My sister Joyce was my best friend. She's a great mom and just a very lively person.
In 2003, Joyce found out she was pregnant with a second child. She was offered an HIV test as standard prenatal care by her obstetrician.
She called me at work and she was like, I got something to tell you. And I was like, well, what is it? She said, I'm HIV positive. So I took a deep breath. I said, well, it's not the end of the world. And she said, well, Nell, I met this doctor today and he's a specialist. And he says that there's some medicines I can take that'll keep my baby from being HIV positive.
Nevirapine. Warning. Severe life-threatening skin reactions, including fatal cases.
One morning, she was covered in these welts and this rash. It was all over her face. It was all over her chest, all over her arms, her hands.
When they're talking about a rash that can kill you, they're talking about a drug that targets the actively replicating cells in your dermis, in your mucosal layers, in your intestine, and stops them from working. And what happens? Goodbye skin.
I would never take them. I don't have a problem with other people taking them, but I, as Griselda Kananda personally, looking at the side effects that they come with, looking at the toxins that they present in my body, not now, not ever.
I have patients tested in 1985. They were all advised to take treatment, but they declined the treatment for different reasons. Because they didn't want to take toxic drugs because they were feeling well at that time.
And how are they doing today?
They're still living.
Healthy?
Yeah.
Once we came to the conclusion that this was the drug that was causing this problem, irregardless of what the HIV was going to do, she was going to come off the drug no matter what.
If taking her off the drugs meant that she could sleep through the night and be happy for 6 months, that would be worth it, rather than live in agony for 2 years or 12 months.
You hear a lot of doctors, you hear a lot of educators in AIDS, you hear a lot of people talk about it is probably the drugs that are going to kill us before the disease does.
What are the drugs doing to the bodies? They're putting the bodies into coffins.
Before my sister started taking the drugs, she was healthy. After she started the drugs, she developed an allergic reaction, which made her look like a patient with full-blown AIDS. She was admitted to the hospital. She continued to spiral down. And within 37 days from her first date of taking the medicine, she was gone.
When news of Joyce's death reached the NIH, emails were exchanged between the director of the AIDS division and an ethics and safety officer. Ed, there was fulminant liver failure resulting in the death on this trial last week. Ouch. Not much we can do about dumb docs.
They're cynical enough to introduce drugs that they know will have toxic effects and will carry a certain mortality, and they know that the life of the drug before this mortality becomes too obvious to ignore is, say, 2 or 3 years, and they work out what the sales are going to be in those 2 or 3 years, and then they know they're going to have to reduce the dose.
Joyce has 2 sons. Jamal he's in his senior year of high school this year. Sterling will be 4 years old. And in my mind, they were robbed of their mother.
If someone's going to be giving me a diagnosis of certain death in 5 to 7 years, I want scientific proof. This isn't a religion.
My interest in questioning and breaking and exploring does HIV cause AIDS is an instinct to liberate people from a death sentence that isn't theirs to carry.
After we took Lindsay off AZT, her weight did go up.
Within a couple of days, the leg cramps went away.
And her physical body seemed to be doing pretty well, but it was like she was disturbed. She was agitated very easily.
Her lifespan changed all the time after she got to be 2 years old, and then she'd only live to be 5.
When she got to be a little older, then they said, oh, she might live to be 7.
Yep. But definitely wouldn't live into double digits, and that's just was our life then.
Although Lindsay was on AZT for 22 months, she made a full recovery from the pernicious side effects. Lindsay will be 19 in October of 2009.
Because it's been surrounded from day one with so much emotion, so much fear, so much psychology, so much drama, very few people are capable of looking at AIDS logically.
We can be exposed to HIV many times without being chronically infected. Our immune system could get rid of the virus within a few weeks if you have a good immune system.
If you have a good immune system, then your body can naturally get rid of HIV.
Yes.
If you take a poor African who's been infected and you build up their immune system, Is it possible for them to also naturally get rid of it?
I would think so.
It's very easy to get people to think the right thing if you get the right on the tablet the first time. But once something's on the tablet and you got to erase it and put something else, it's very hard to get people to think differently.
The victims of HIV and the dedicated professionals combating it deserve our sympathy, compassion, and respect. However, at Journey's End, I find myself perplexed, bewildered at times with an overall feeling of dismay and sadness. I found a research community in disarray over the most fundamental understanding of HIV, all the while presenting a monolithic public posture of authority and certainty. Bluntly stated, we have tests that prove nothing, remedies that kill, and statistics manipulated to the point of absurdity. 90% of global HIV corresponds to areas of great poverty and squalor. Ironically, while we may have been pursuing a phantom killer, a shape-shifting assassin, perhaps the real enemy has been hiding in plain view, clear as day, and as old as time.
We can be exposed to HIV many times without being chronically infected. Our immune system will get rid of the virus within a few weeks if you have a good immune system.
If you have a good immune system, then your body can naturally get rid of HIV.
Yes.
How can we say that HIV is the cause of AIDS when we don't know, based on current tests, whether or not anybody diagnosed positive actually has HIV?
Some people are very fortunate, they don't have these side effects, but many people do. So prolonged treatment is impossible.
Called CD4 helper T cells.
What the fuck's he mean? What's it in
it uses its membrane.
What does he mean that they're not co-factors? Where is he coming from? There's co-factors for everything.
To the membrane of the cell.
There, the cell virus grows, they form the cells.
Gallo isn't going to change that. It's probably out in the circulation.
Finds other CD4
He's
cells.
going to remember effects.
There is an ongoing battle. Cells die, the body will replace those cells that die, but there's not an infinite capacity to use
co-factors are important.
This
really
battle between HIV...
how people get ill, why they get ill.
What is asked of an AIDS journalist is to deny an existing reality, which is a strong, growing body of dissent on a scientific